A trip of goodwill to open new vistas in China's ties with Europe. On Friday, Chinese President Xi Jinping is expected to wrap up his 5-day visit to France, Serbia and Hungary on his first official tour to Europe in 5 years. The three countries rode out the red carpet to welcome the Chinese guests, stirring a China fervor among the local people and heated discussions in the media. While new opportunities are set to open up in Beijing's collaboration with these three countries, skepticism lingers over EU's policies on how to approach its second-largest trading partner. To what extent has this trip brought clarity to the issue? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Beijing by Professor Cui Hongjian, Director of the Center for the European Union and Regional Development Studies at Beijing Foreign Studies University. From Hong Kong by Sebastian Cotin, Geopolitics Analyst and Asia Global Fellow at the University of Hong Kong, and from Washington, D.C. by Anton Fediashin, Associate Professor of History at the American University. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So we are going to cover a lot of issues: undercapacity on the part of the European Union, the lack of imagination, possibly brain deadness of the EU, according to some people. But first, let's get to the bilateral significance of this trip. New terms have been added to relations between China and the three countries. For France, for instance, instead of stable, mutually beneficial, enterprising and dynamic, we now have breaking new grounds, a strong sense of responsibility. For Serbia, now we're building a community of shared future between China and Serbia, making that the first such country in Europe. And for Hungary, we are seeing a new all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership. Professor Cui, what is your takeaway of these new keywords on the bilateral level?
I would like to say this trip by President Xi to Europe would be a continuing effort from China's side, try to promote relations with Europe. As we know that in recent years there has been a discussion or even debate within the European countries to perhaps change its policies or attitude towards China. As we know, especially because of COVID-19, because of the Ukrainian crisis, indeed, there has been a problem for the mutual trust or mutual perception. So I think on this regard, this trip by President Xi, it tried to continue Chinese efforts to stabilize relations with European countries and to promote the mutual confidence for some more cooperation or some other, discussing on important issues like Ukraine and Palestine or Gaza, some other. Indeed, I think if we look at the so-called fruit of this visit, undoubtedly, it achieved a lot of the on bilateral level. For example, to promote so-called strategic mutual trust between China and France, because as we know, for both two bigger players in the international relations, is so necessary and important at this moment, especially when French side try to raise the issue of to establish more European strategic autonomy, and also on the bilateral relations with Serbia and Hungary. Undoubtedly, a big promotion, I think. For example, for this comprehensive strategic partnership with Serbia, it will go to a shared future for community, and also for the Hungary is all-weather strategic partnership on new areas and other. So I think indeed it achieves a lot. I think it gives us some more confidence for Chinese side to have some more focus
Yeah.
on its relations with European countries.
Yeah. Sebastian, what is your take from your perspective, looking at the upgrading, the elevation of bilateral relations among the three countries out of the 40 more capitals, European countries on the European continent?
Well, the trip to Europe is the perfect barometer for understanding where China-EU relations stand right now. And while I don't disagree with Professor Anton, even with all the agreements and promises on the table and words it seems like the core issues, the usual issues, still pending, causing tension in the relationship, are still hanging in the air, unresolved, so to speak. So one key observation, first of all, is the substantial gap in time since President Xi last visited Europe, despite being a crucial European Union, being a major trading partner of China. And this reality catches the eye, especially when you look at how Europe was actively working and traveling to Beijing for the past 18 months. And maybe another significant aspect to note is that the visit comes against the backdrop of structural changes, geopolitical changes since presidencies last 5 years ago. Back then, the US was still in Afghanistan, COVID hadn't hit yet, Russia hadn't invaded Ukraine, the UK was in the European Union, Brussels didn't start at trade tensions with Chinese exports. So jumping to the present, China's economy now confronts several crises, while Europe is meeting security challenges such as the threats
Right.
of a Russian invasion and the uncertain fate of NATO. And in this context, agreements, in my view, take a backseat to evaluating the overall state of the relationship. And sure, you can agree on this or that, but in the end, this is almost secondary because what really matters, unfortunately, is that the underlying structure of the relationship remains unchanged.
And the underlying structure of this relationship is, in one sentence, again, Sebastian.
Well, in one sentence, I would say that today there are still many things to improve because there are many really long statements. Really, they were drafting um, very long outlines, but the reality is that the core issues are
Okay.
still pending, are still there.
All right, all right. Anton, what is your take, observing from the United States, the significance, at least on the bilateral level, but also on the European level?
From the United States perspective, I think the strategy towards China, the EU, and Russia is a very complex equation. I think the United States, the Biden administration, has decided that it will pit the EU against Russia, which will untie the United States' hands to then challenge China. And it's trying to play this game, hoping that the Chinese and the Russians and even the EU won't notice. My colleagues both just spoke about France as a single sovereign unit. I was very interested to notice that Ursula von der Leyen, the EU representative, was there during the Paris meeting between President Macron and President Xi, and she seemed to be playing the role of a sort of a nanny and a directing force to make sure that President Macron didn't take any overly sovereign steps in trying to balance France's relationship with China. Both countries would be naturally interested in primarily economic relations, but with the EU, there is always the geopolitical aspect. And so I think that what Sebastian just said is correct in the sense that there are still many things left unanswered. Let me give you a couple of examples of specific issues that need to be resolved. Where the EU ends and NATO begins is an open question. Just a year ago,
Right.
in the
Don't
Lithuanian
expand
capital
for
of
now,
Vilnius.
Anton. Don't expand for now. Just list the things, please.
Then
Yeah.
let's
Where the
sure.
EU, where the NATO
that's
stand. Yeah.
that's
Where
great.
the NATO
That's
ends.
one of them where
Yeah.
that ends and where the other begins. Whether the EU and the US see the EU and the Belt and Road Initiative actually compatible. And ultimately, the third one is whether the United States is interested in Europe profiting from its trade with China, specifically France and Hungary, but the EU as a whole, or whether the United States is its real aim is to use the EU and its individual members as levers, as weapons
Okay.
against China in the broader strategic geoeconomic
Yeah.
game.
All right. Okay. Pretty clear. You mentioned 3 points there at least. So let's talk about what is the core, what are the core issues, or what is the biggest core issue that's left unresolved here? From what when Anton said, it seems that it's more or less how the EU approaches this relationship. There's not much what China can do. Professor Cui, what is your take? What is the core issue here? China is there offering opportunities. The EU seems to be struggling on how to approach it.
Yes, if we look at it, it's witnessed by President Xi, especially very interesting arrangement from French side is the trilateral talks between European Union, France, and China. We can find that the two major focuses for all of the three parties. Firstly, how about these economic relations? Indeed, this market access issue. We can find that even some gaming between China and the European Union on so-called overcapacity or some, even more favorable marketing, conditions for European companies in China. Another focus I could say would be it's also a product of the translation of international order, especially from a European Union side, in the name of geopolitical translation. So I think now, undoubtedly, both two sides or three parties they have to focus on some more, geopolitical issue, including Ukraine and Gaza or some other. So there's two major focus or two major issues. Undoubtedly, we do have some difference. We do have some different understanding and a different approach. But now I think that a very good message from this talks, from this communication, could be that even we are different, but we are trying to find some more common grounds.
Yeah.
I think a very very remarkable product is the joint statement by China and France and
Yeah.
Middle East issue.
Yeah, there's no doubt on that. I think the issue, the joint statement between China and France on the war in Gaza in particular is a very encouraging step, and also the statement on biodiversity, climate change. However, the statement that comes out of the European Union from Ms. von der Leyen after the trilateral meeting, it seems that Europe, or some people in Europe, continue to refuse to own the problem. For instance, she talks about combined with the domestic demand that is not increasing, the world cannot absorb China's surplus production. Therefore, she has encouraged the Chinese government to address these structural overcapacities. At the same time, she will closely coordinate with the G7 countries and emerging economies that are also increasingly affected by China's market distortions. Sebastian, a lot of people here in China really do not agree, and I know international observers, they are actually talking about an undercapacity on the part of Europe or West in general. Is it undercapacity or is it overcapacity? And why is she speaking on behalf of the world?
Oh, Ms. Liu, I would answer that both questions are right, and the answer is yes, there is undercapacity in Europe and there is overcapacity in China. The European Union, first of all, the European Union has intensified scrutiny of China through anti-subsidy investigations, targeting critical sectors like electric vehicles, wind turbines, train manufacturing. And in response, China deploys diplomatic strategies and retaliatory measures like export restrictions on critical raw materials, the gallium, germanium, graphite, even rare earth technologies, to punish European efforts in what is called the so-called de-risking, right? So, the visit addresses a diplomatic need. None of the discussed issues appear ready for immediate change, and this is one of them. And this is actually a repeated pattern that has become more and more evident as EU leaders raised already similar concerns with President Xi in December 2023 in Beijing, and progress has been minimal. So, if you are
but the thing is, I think we are disagreeing. What is really the problem? Is it a problem of Chinese overcapacity or a problem of European undercapacity? Or very simply speaking, European being a sore loser, not admitting that China has done better in some sectors, that they have to simply catch up, work harder.
But maybe the European leaders can't say that in public, but it's very obvious. But also in China, there are scholars like Professor Lu Feng from Peking University, who was admitting that supply overflow exists in China in several sectors. So always there are this battle of narratives. Of course, in Europe they try to protect the local environment. In China, the domestic
So,
industries. But both problems exist. There is overproduction in China, and there is, unluckily in Europe, now there is a huge competitiveness problem, as has been underlined by the last reports written by Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi, two former Italian prime ministers, who have underlined just this, that Europe is not doing right and has to do better.
I mean, from what von der Leyen was saying, it seems that she refuses to admit there's an undercapacity problem. She solely put the blame on China having a structural overproduction, and she concluded for the world that there is not enough demand, whereas in a lot of part of the world, demands for Chinese-made green technology, green vehicles have been on the rise. I simply don't understand that. Sebastian, you can respond maybe a bit later, but Anton, let me give you that question for now.
Well, this brings us back to the question of all things of the difference between NATO and the EU. Part of the reason for what is called European undercapacity, which is a very roundabout and vague way to say that Europe is being deindustrialized as we speak. Part of the reason for that is because of the Ukraine conflict and the fact that the Europeans gleefully cut themselves off from reliable and cheap Russian gas, which has had a chilling, devastating effect on the European economies. We've got all of the IMF figures for last year, where now Russia, which is the most sanctioned country in the world, also has the fastest developing economy in Europe, which no one in their right mind would have possibly predicted, let's say, 5 years ago. So that's part of the reason for the so-called undercapacity of Europe. In other words, geopolitical aims have undermined the European economy. Instead of addressing the fundamental causes for those aims, Ursula von der Leyen, during the President Xi's visit to Paris, took her press conference to essentially voice threats against China, and she was very explicit about this, that the EU will do something about Chinese overcapacity. And by the way, that kind of narrative is exactly what Janet Yellen had said during her visit to China just a month and a half ago. So this is a sort of a ganging up on the Chinese, and the rest of the world seems to be perfectly happy to trade with the Chinese, both in Eurasia and on the rest of our planet. Look, this is very much, as Sebastian said, a battle of narratives. The problem is that narratives do not lead to economic growth.
Yeah.
Smart policy does. And
Absolutely.
unfortunately, there's a little bit of shortage of that in the US.
In the US or in the EU, or Anton?
And in the EU.
And in the EU.
I'm treating the West as a bloc here when it comes to geoeconomics.
Yeah. I'm seriously not just talking about narratives, because narratives is a war of words, which doesn't necessarily need anyway, except that you look good on television.
Exactly.
On television. But the real problem here is there is a lot of need for green technology. There is a lot of need for jobs. Chinese investment in Hungary, for instance, for NEV cars or batteries are creating jobs through the Belt and Road Initiative. Serbia is benefiting from its ties with China, from its open policies with Chinese economic interaction. Europe is on economic stagnation, even recession, and it's saying, no, we don't want Chinese-made cheap cars. We don't want Chinese-made cheap products, because we're going to protect our industry. We're going to protect our workers. You know what? Maybe they can protect the European workers for a month, for a year. How about 10 years from now on? Mr. Cui, are this kind of arguments being a little bit too Chinese-centric, or I don't know, am I being too biased here?
From China's perspective, I think this so-called overcapacity issue on Chinese products is not unfair. Is unfair. I mean, reason to try to limit this. I think the competition, a real competition between China and some other economies, especially now with European Union. Also, now it's a very strange situation here. Is we are talking about overcapacity. It looks like an economic, concept, but indeed, it's not a concept from a real market or even economic consideration. It's from a political or even security consideration. As we know now, the reasons now for China try to defend its attitude on this issue is firstly the demand from not only from the European Union market and also from other economies is still rising,
Right.
rising. So I think that now Chinese products on EVs or some other new economy products is still for their purpose to promote the efforts to deal with the climate change. So and also another I think reason for China is Chinese products is a high quality products. So there is no issue of so-called overcapacity.
Yeah.
Another I think a very big reason is it's a very important issue for this diversity or for these divergences within European Union. As we know now, yes, we mentioned about Hungary. Hungary got a lot of benefits from this so-called Chinese overcapacity. But now I think that at this moment, indeed, maybe the real consideration, real concern from France or some other countries in European Union try to push forward this issue. I mean, the anti-subsidy investigation against Chinese products is China should have some more joint venture. So China China should open its value chain or industry chain to some other more European countries.
Well, I think that's the messages that the Chinese president has sent out, right? China has taken down the barrier to foreign investment on the manufacturing sector. Of course, it has taken some steps. It's taken years for China to come this far. Now, on the part of Europe, Sebastian, is Europe willing to say, okay, China invited foreign enterprises to come into the Chinese market, set up joint ventures, take profit, but also we, the Chinese, have gained tremendously from it, from the competition. Even this is still happening with Tesla being a catfish in the Chinese pond. Why is Europe not dare to give it a try?
Well, I don't know if I would describe it that way, but the reality is that every country in the world has economic security measures and is trying to protect their own domestic markets. So this is not only Europe.
You don't have to open altogether. You can take small steps.
Well, actually, it's at the European companies. This is a historical issue that was tried to be solved with a comprehensive agreement on investments, that many European companies cannot access the Chinese markets, whereas the Chinese companies have open access to the single market in the European Union. So I mean, we can frame the debate however we want, but the reality is that everyone should be more cautious, that they have to go back to what used to be called the globalization and cooperate. I agree with you on that. So European companies now are cautious about Chinese companies usually because of competition issues, intellectual property rights, fair trade practices. But the reality is that the European Union's industrial strength doesn't match up the American and the Chinese. And this actually puts the European companies and the competitive advantage at risk, especially when now there are all these different policies prioritizing security over economic growth. This is a total shift, a new change of paradigm that will last for, unlikely for many decades. So what Europe should do now is, instead of thinking about, many products coming from China that are dumping our markets, okay, just compete. Okay, you have to focus on reindustrialization, as Professor Anton was mentioning, putting innovation and competitiveness first to tackle long-term challenges effectively. And one thing more, there is not a consensus on this in many different things. We have to consider that there are disagreements among Germany, France, the president of the European Commission, when it comes to views on China. However, in terms of overcapacity, there is an absolute consensus. So they don't
can
see.
you prove? Can you prove that there's an absolute consensus? I mean, in America, there's an absolute consensus between the two parties about China being a threat. Is that true, or is that a problem of misconception without
that's a reality,
difference?
of course.
Yeah.
That's a reality. That there is the only bipartisan agreement today in the U.S. is about China. That's a reality.
Well, China being a threat, and I'm saying that could be a wrong perception, a wrong consensus against facts. That's what I'm saying, Sebastian.
Well, it's the so-called China threat that in reality, what lies behind is that they are scared that China is progressing very fast and is going
Does
to
that
be
mean that
able.
China has to be a threat? And
Well,
although
I
that
mean,
might be a
both.
consensus, it could be a wrong consensus. This is what I'm saying. And this is what I'm saying about Europe, and I'm not alone here, is Europe is having a wrong, some Europeans are having a wrong idea about China being a rival instead of more of an opportunity. And that is the problem.
And more, because this is also, again, you were saying before that narratives, you have to consider narratives from diverse perspectives. So this is one of the main narratives in Europe now, is to strengthen this concept of systemic rivalry of China.
And Anton, yeah, let you jump in here. Do you see the problem here? I'm saying that although there may be a consensus, it could be a wrong and dangerous, misleading consensus.
Yes, and that's certainly the consensus in the United States, and it's used as an argument to essentially nationalize what the Americans call a global economic system. And it's the same thing in Europe. As an historian, I can tell you that we've gone through these cycles of countries that are whose economies are not performing up to par, blaming it on their competitors instead of looking at themselves. To overcome this for the EU, you need to have not just politicians, but leaders with imagination and a political will, not to constantly play the victim, but to actually come up with creative solutions. Looking at Ursula von der Leyen, Charles Michel, and the majority, by the way, of European, not EU, but European politicians, that talent and that vision right now is lacking. Maybe after the cascade of elections that are sweeping across Europe this year, including to the EU, by the way, this summer, something will change.
Do you see some hope, Anton? I'm giving you the last minute because I do see some hope in President Macron. He was seriously warning about the future of Europe if it does not become more stronger, more sovereign. Of course, he criticized China's trade policy, but he is able at least to see things from his own perspective. Anton.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end this program on a sour and pessimistic note because I see no hope among the politicians of today. I find it absolutely exhausting to follow everything that Emmanuel Macron says, because he says one thing on Monday, then reverses himself on Tuesday, then on Wednesday, the neocon whistle sounds in Washington, and he reverses himself again. No.
At least he's sounding the alarm. He's arousing
the discussion. And he sounded the alarm on NATO and made many other things, and it's produced absolutely no results. I think that his sounding the alarm is precisely why Ms. von der Leyen was there at the table to make sure that he doesn't sound too many of them.
we have to leave it there. Many thanks for the discussion. Time is very limited. Many thanks to Professor Cui Hongjian, Sebastian Cotin in Hong Kong, and Anton Fideashin joining us from Washington, D.C. With that, we wrap up this edition of The Point with me, Lu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Lu Xin in Beijing. You've got the point.